over the last 2 years, I have talked extensively about the importance of military industrial output and the reasons why the United States, despite its larger population, its larger GDP, its supposedly larger economy, why despite that, despite astronomically higher levels of military spending, not just the US, but the collective West is unable to outproduce Russia in weapons and ammunition in regards to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Now, I have recently wrote an article for New Eastern Outlook titled "Fatal Flaws Undermine America's Defense Industrial Base." And this is an article about the recent National Defense Industrial Strategy report. And this was published it was written over the course of last year, published at the end of last year, and it was recently made public. I read all 60 pages. I'll include the link in the video description below. You can download it here. It's a PDF file. And it is a report that talks all about all of the very many problems the American defense industrial base has. And then they attempt to formulate solutions to these problems. But of course, they fail ultimately to identify the most pressing underlying problem, and therefore they fail to come up with an adequate solution to address it because they're not even acknowledging it. So let me read through this article that I wrote, just in case you prefer to listen to me read it rather than reading it yourself. And also I'm going to include several other quotes from the report that if I included it in the article would have just made it way too long, and also some pertinent examples of why some of these solutions they explore in the report, why they're just not going to work in the real world. So let's begin by reading this article that I wrote for New Eastern Outlook, Fatal Flaws Undermine America's Defense Industrial Base. The first ever US Department of Defense National Defense Industrial Strategy report confirms what many analysts have concluded in regards to the unsustainable nature of Washington's global spanning foreign policy objectives and its defense industrial base's inability to achieve them. The report lays out a multitude of problems plaguing the U.S. defense industrial base, including a lack of surge capacity, inadequate workforce, offshore downstream suppliers, as well as insufficient demand signals to motivate private industry partners to produce what is needed in the quantities needed when it is needed. In fact, the majority of the problems identified by the report involved private industry and its unwillingness to meet national security requirements because they were not profitable. For example, the report attempts to explain why many companies across the U.S. defense industrial base lack advanced manufacturing capabilities, claiming many elements of the traditional defense industrial base have yet to adopt advanced manufacturing technologies as they struggle to develop business cases for needed capital investment. In other words, while adopting advanced manufacturing technologies would fulfill the purpose of the U.S. Department of Defense, it is not profitable for private industry to do so. So let me just stop right there and point out they're struggling to develop business cases, a business case for the needed capital investment. They cannot rationalize in their own minds why it would be worth it to them to adopt advanced manufacturing technologies. Because yes, it would allow the United States to achieve its national defense objectives, if you want to use that euphemism, defense, but it's not profitable for these companies to do so, so they themselves are disinterested. Even if in reality it was about defending the country, they wouldn't be interested because all they care about is profits. Before I get back to the article, I want to give you some more examples of how in this report itself, they talk about these problems and all of these problems revolving around private industry not finding what is required of them profitable, so they do not do it. So the report also says things like this. The Department of Defense is not a large player in most industrial markets. The Department of Defense's low volume buying patterns, lengthy periods between modernization, and often unnecessarily over-customized design specifications have combined to make the Department of Defense an unattractive customer, especially for smaller businesses. So that is how the US looks at the defense industry. Department of Defense is just another customer, and the industry is uninterested in meeting the demands of this customer because there is no profit in it for them. They're spelling it out. It's not about achieving goals related to national defense. It's about what is and isn't profitable. The report also says unreliable cash flow to small businesses make the defense industrial base more fragile and less secure. And this is driven by a range of issues from appropriation delays to commonly used contracting practices. Regulations and business practices can be difficult to understand, costly to implement, and in a myriad of ways often create barriers to doing business with the Department of Defense because everything is transactional. There is no real industry in the US that actually serves the purpose of the state, of the American people ultimately. It is all about profits, and it is all about the Department of Defense interacting with industry as just another customer. And because the Department of Defense depends on private industry, it becomes harder and harder to work with smaller companies because the smaller the company gets, the bigger the risk is for them to work with the Department of Defense. They much rather do some other safer type of business where they can make their profits, and there aren't barriers to enter the market like there is doing business with the Department of Defense. That's what they're saying. So let me get back to the article that I wrote. I continue. I say, despite virtually all the problems the report identified stemming from private industry's disproportionate influence over the US defense industrial base, the report never identifies private industry itself as a problem, or I should say, the problem. If private industry and its prioritization of profits is the central problem inhibiting the defense industrial base from fulfilling its purpose, the obvious solution is nationalizing the defense industrial base by replacing private industry with state-owned enterprises. This allows government to prioritize purpose over profits. Yet in the United States and across Europe, the so-called military-industrial complex has grown to such proportions that it is no longer subordinated to the government and national interests, but rather the government and national interests are subordinated to it. The military-industrial complex, along with other large corporate financier interests across the West, they control the government. They have power over national interests rather than the government and national interests having control over them, which in other countries is actually the case. The government and the national interests of the people living in that country come first. These corporations come second. And if the corporations cannot meet the demands of the government and national interests, state enterprises are created in order to do so. And then they successfully solve these problems. I'll get into that more in greater detail later. There's a Guardian article that I've already cited in an earlier update on the situation in Ukraine that spells it out explicitly. Finally, after 2 years, they finally spell it out for their readers. So this report, if you read through it, 60 pages, they go through all of these different solutions that almost sound like nationalization, but just fall short of it, like sharing risk between private industry and governments and making more money available, subsidizing these corporations to adopt capabilities like maintaining excess manufacturing capacity. And the report admits how hard it is to change this system and how hard it is to rapidly mobilize the American defense industrial base. This is what it says. It says, however, there is nothing rapid about mobilization. It is time and resource intensive. To best posture the government, industry, and armed services and our allies and partners, we need to think about how the steps we can take today to set the conditions for potential mobilization in the future. The Department of Defense needs to act now to set those conditions and consider mobilization requirements and the associated authorities and plans to successfully address the demands of the National Defense Strategy. And if you're not familiar with the National Defense Strategy, it basically says the US must maintain primacy over the entire planet, and it must contain Russia and China in order to do so. That is the premise all of this is built on, and I will get into that also here in just a moment. It also talks about, because US industry cannot meet the demands of the Department of Defense, so then this report talks about using all of America's so-called allies. And this is what the report says. The United States has a complex web of friend-shoring suitable alliances and partnerships around the world. A partial list includes Australia, Canada, the European Union, India, Israel, Japan, Mexico, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. Standardization will also support rapid industrial mobilization by enabling surge, expansion, or conversion at times of need. NATO standards provide an excellent example of international standards and interoperability programs which have proven their value in shifting munitions inventories to support Ukraine and resisting the Russian Federation's aggression. But actually, it's the exact opposite. It's literally the exact opposite. We can see that NATO has not properly standardized anything, and the myth of NATO interoperability has been clearly overstated. We can see that in Ukraine right now. And I want to give you a specific example of this. And I've talked about this many times before. I've talked about main battle tanks. Ukraine was running out of main battle tanks. They needed additional tanks from the West, so the West began sending. First, they tried to find any old Soviet-era main battle tanks they had laying around, especially in Eastern Europe. They sent that to Ukraine, and then they began sending Western main battle tanks. The Leopard 2 from Germany, and then eventually Leopard 1s because they did not have enough Leopard 2s. They sent the Challenger 2 from the United Kingdom, and of course the M1 Abrams from the United States. What's interesting, and I've talked about how each one of these main battle tanks are not actually, they're not standardized, they are not interoperable. The M1 Abrams might use the same ammunition as the Leopard 2, but it has entirely different optics, fire control, a completely different engine. It has a turbine engine, while the Leopard 2 has a diesel engine. The United Kingdom's Challenger 2 has a completely different engine, fire control, and optics. It also uses a completely different gun and ammunition. It has a rifled gun with rifled ammunition. It is not interoperable with either the M1 Abrams or the Leopard 2. So these three main battle tanks sent to Ukraine create a dilemma for Ukraine in terms of each of these having different training, sustainment, and maintenance requirements. All three of them have completely different requirements, which means Ukraine, instead of having one supply chain for one type of main battle tank, now they have three. A training pipeline, instead of one, they have three, and so on. And it creates a disaster. And this is exactly why armies standardize their equipment to avoid this. And it's interesting because the M1 Abrams and the Leopard 2, you may or may not already know this, it actually started out as a joint development program between the United States and Germany. And if it continued and it produced a tank that was adopted across all of NATO, then that would have been standardization. That would have represented interoperability. And if NATO had huge inventories of just this one tank and they sent it to Ukraine, it would have vastly improved these problems that Ukraine is facing. Would not have solved them, but it would be much less a problem for Ukraine to overcome. And there's this article here from the National Interest, and they actually show this tank, the MBT-70, Main Battle Tank 70, the German-American super tank that never came to be. So the US in this National Defense Industrial Strategy report is talking about how they're going to work with all of these different nations all around the globe, because America's own industrial base cannot provide what the Department of Defense requires. But look at just one project, one tank project. Let's read about all the problems that it had. It said, from the outset, development was hindered by measurement units. The West Germans wanted to use metric, and the Americans wanted to use their measuring system. The US is still using inches and feet, while the rest of the world uses millimeters, centimeters, meters, kilometers. So that was already a problem. And then it says, ultimately, the MBT-70 was killed by cost overruns and technological complexity. West Germany went on to develop the Leopard 2, in the United States, the Abrams M1, both of which still remain in service. Perhaps it was for the better. The MBT-70 never made it past the prototype stage. They never really explain why they said that. Because if it did make it past the prototype stage, if it didn't go over cost, if it was a practical design and is widely adopted across NATO, NATO would not be having the problems in Ukraine that they're having right now. The reason NATO never standardized its main battle tanks or its aircraft or its artillery or pretty much anything else, there's certain ammunition standards that they do share, but beyond that, everything else, each country has their own version. And it's not as interoperable as people imagine it to be. And the reason they did that was because each one of these countries had a for-profit driven defense industrial base. The US has its corporations that want to not just make money building and selling tanks, but they want to make the money involved in developing it as well. Germany has Rheinmetall. They wanted to make money. The United Kingdom has BAE. France has Nexter. Italy has their own company making a main battle tank. Turkey has their own completely different main battle tank. It's all about the companies, the corporations in each one of these countries wanting to make money at the expense of standardization, at the expense of interoperability. So the myth of NATO standardization and interoperability is on display right now in Ukraine, being dispelled. Compare what I described regarding just the M1 Abrams, Leopard 2, and Challenger 2, all of the different requirements each tank has, how they're basically three completely different tanks. Compare that with, say, the Russian T-72 and T-90, which account for the majority of main battle tanks on the battlefield, and even the T-80. The T-80, T-72, and T-90, when they're modernized, they all share the same gun, fire control, optics. The only difference is the engine. The T-80 has a turbine engine. The T-72 and T-90, the latest versions, share the same diesel engine. This creates real standardization. This creates real interoperability. This streamlines training, and this is what a military actually has to do to maximize efficiency and effectiveness on the battlefield. So again, this National Defense Industrial Strategy report, 60 pages, they're ignoring the lack of real standardization and interoperability among NATO, and instead they're counting this myth as an actual strength rather than a fundamental weakness that needs to be overcome. So let me get back to my article for New Eastern Outlook. It's a bit of a tangent, but I think you can see how it's all related. So I continue with the article. The US defense industrial strategy is built on a flawed premise. Beyond private industry's hold on the US defense industrial base, the very premise the national defense industrial strategy is built on is fundamentally flawed, deeply rooted in private industry's profit-driven prioritization. The report claims the purpose of this national defense industrial strategy is to drive development of an industrial ecosystem that provides a sustained competitive advantage to the United States over its adversaries. Who are America's adversaries? Just to name two, Russia and China. Is it realistic for the United States to maintain a competitive edge over China alone, let alone Russia and China, let alone the rest of the world? The notion of the United States perpetually expanding its wealth and power across the globe unrivaled by its so-called adversaries, is unrealistic. China alone has a population 4 to 5 times greater than the US. China's population is, in fact, larger than that of the G7 combined. China has a larger industrial base, economy, and education system than the US. China's education system not only produces millions more graduates each year in essential fields like science, technology, and engineering than the United States, the proportion of such graduates is higher in China than in the US. In other words, they have a greater total of graduates. They also have a greater proportion of their society being turned out as graduates in these essential fields. China alone possesses the means to maintain a competitive advantage over the United States now and well into the foreseeable future. The US attempting to draw up a strategy to maintain an advantage over China, not to mention over the rest of the world, regardless of these realities, borders on delusion. Yet for 60 pages, US policymakers attempt to lay out a strategy to do just that. Then I begin explaining why it's not just China outcompeting the US. Very obviously, it's also Russia. While China is repeatedly mentioned as America's pacing challenge, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is perhaps the most acute example of a shifting balance of global power. Despite a combined population, GDP, and military budget many times greater than Russia's, the collective West is incapable of matching Russian production or even relatively simple munitions like artillery shells, let alone more complex systems like tanks, aircraft, and precision-guided missiles. While the US and its allies appear to have every conceivable advantage over Russia on paper, the collective West has organized itself as a profit-driven rather than purpose-driven society. In Russia, the defense industry exists to serve national security. While one might believe this goes without saying, across the collective West, the defense industry, like all other industries in the West, exists solely to maximize profits. To best serve national security, the defense industry is required to maintain substantial surge capacity, meaning additional unused factory space, machines, and labor on standby if and when large surges in production are required in relatively short periods of time. Across the West, in order to maximize profits, surge capacity has been ruthlessly slashed, deemed economically inefficient. Only rare exceptions exist, such as US 155mm artillery shell production. Keep that in mind, because I'll mention that again later in this article. While the West's defense industry remains the most profitable on Earth, its ability to actually churn out arms and ammunition in the quantities and quality required for large-scale conflict is clearly compromised by its maximization of profits. The result is evident today as the West struggles to expand production of arms and ammunition for its Ukrainian proxies. The National Defense Industrial Strategy Report would say, prior to the invasion, weapon procurements for some of the in-demand systems were driven by annual training requirements and ongoing combat operations. This modest demand, along with recent market dynamics, drove companies to divest excess capacity due to cost. So there we go with profits again, obsession with profits above all else. This meant that any increased production requirements would require an increase in workforce hours in existing facilities, commonly referred to as surge capacity. These, in turn, were limited further by similar downstream considerations of workforce, facility, and supply chain limitations. So it's not just the big corporations that make arms and ammunition in the United States, it's also all their downstream suppliers. They are all profit-driven as well, and they also slash and eliminate surge capacity, excess production capacity to maximize profits. So even if a big company were capable of surge capacity, their downstream suppliers are not. This is a huge problem all across the West. Back to the article. Costs are most certainly a consideration across any defense industry, but costs cannot be the primary consideration. A central element of Russia's defense industry is Rostec, a massive state-owned enterprise under which hundreds of companies related to national industrial needs, including defense, are organized. Rostec is profitable. However, the industrial concerns organized under Rostec serve purposes related to Russia's national interests, first and foremost, be it national health, infrastructure, or national security. Because Russia's defense industry is purpose-driven, it produced military equipment because it was necessary, not because it was profitable. As a result, Russia possessed huge stockpiles of ammunition and equipment ahead of its special military operation launched in February 2022. In addition to this, Russia maintained large amounts of surge capacity, enabling production rates of everything from artillery shells to armored vehicles to expand quickly over the past 2 years. Only relatively recently have Western analysts acknowledged this. The New York Times, this article right here, which I've referenced many times before, Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials say. Moscow's missile production now exceeds pre-war levels, officials say, leaving Ukraine especially vulnerable this coming winter. I've gone over this article many, many times before. It admits Russian arms production of not only missiles, but also armored vehicles and artillery shells have exceeded pre-war levels. The article estimates that Russia is producing at least 7 times more ammunition than the US and its Western allies combined. Despite this, Western analysts now claim Russian production will plateau as the limits of surge capacity are reached and new facilities and new sources of raw materials are required, which brings us to this from Rusi. I've heard many pro-Ukrainian commentators cite this claim. I believe it originated from articles like this, Russian military objectives and capacity in Ukraine through 2024. This was published February 13th, 2024. And it says, the Russian Ministry of Defense does not believe it can significantly raise production in subsequent years unless new factories are set up and raw material extraction is invested in with a lead time beyond 5 years. But because Russia's industrial base is purpose-driven rather than profit-driven, additional facilities are already being built despite the longer-term economic inefficiency of doing so. The US government funded Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in a November 2023 article titled, this one right here, Satellite Images Suggest Russia is Ramping Up Production Capacity for its War Against Ukraine. It reported that Russia was not only expanding production at existing facilities, but was also developing new factories producing warplanes, combat helicopters, military drones, and guided munitions. So they know that they will plateau if they simply depend on surge capacity. They're expanding total capacity as well. Next, this article that I wrote for New Eastern Outlook explains why these solutions mentioned in their National Defense Industrial Strategy report, why they fall far short. So this is what I write. The 2023 National Defense Industrial Strategy cites the expansion of 155mm artillery shell production as a demonstration of the US defense industrial base's ability to scale rapidly. This is what the report claims. It says, in response, the Department of Defense has invested in expanding existing production facilities in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and broke ground on a new production facility in Texas to respond to the higher demand signal. There we go again, demand signals. Instead of the requirements of the Department of Defense, everything is broken down into business transactions and market demand. In addition to these investments made in December 2022, the U.S. Army awarded contracts worth $1.5 billion in September 2023 to meet its goal of delivering more than 80,000 projectiles per month by the end of fiscal year 2025. And I have gone over this many, many times in previous videos. And what is the problem with citing this as an example of the US defense industrial base's ability to scale up? I've explained this previously, and I mention it in this article. However, this was only possible because the US Army owns the facilities producing artillery shells. Increased rates of shell production were made possible through existing surge capacity deliberately set up by the US Army years before the Russian special military operation began. This foresight and planning, unfortunately for the United States, is a rare exception to the rule and cannot be applied across the rest of the US and European arms production lines. The West's profit-driven policies have created problems for the U.S. defense industrial base well downstream of production lines for arms and ammunition. This includes America's decades of offshoring production to maximize profits by taking advantage of cheaper labor overseas. Many raw materials and components used across the U.S. defense industrial base today come from overseas, including from adversarial nations. The National Defense Industrial Strategy Report lamented, over the last decade, the Department of Defense has struggled to curtail adversarial sourcing and burnish the integrity of defense supply chains. Despite these efforts, dependence on adversarial sources of supply has grown. The Department of Defense continues to lack a comprehensive effort for mitigating supply chain risks. So what they're saying there is, they're basically referring to China. They're getting components and raw materials from China for their defense industrial base in the US. And they have taken every effort imaginable to try to cut back. And instead of even stopping it, it continues to grow. That is what they're admitting in this report. Let's continue with the article. Profit-driven policies have also hurt the workforce. Decades of offshoring U.S. manufacturing saw America transition to a primarily service-based economy. This was reflected across education as well, where vocational skills were not only neglected, they were stigmatized. The National Defense Industrial Strategy Report would explain that the labor market lacks the required number of skilled workers to meet defense production demand while driving innovation at all levels. This shortfall is becoming exacerbated as baby boomers retire and younger generations show less interest in manufacturing and engineering careers. Beyond this problem, profit-driven policies have made education in the United States inaccessible. The desire to profit from providing education has usurped the actual purpose of providing education in the first place, which is the creation of human resources required to run a functioning, prosperous society. Degrees and training courses in the US today require loans that can take a lifetime to pay off. A lack of interest in skilled labor and the inaccessibility of education in the United States has resulted in a skewed workforce relative to the rest of the world. The number of STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics graduates in the US, for example, is comparable to Russia, despite Russia having less than half the total population of the US. In 2016, there were 568,000 STEM graduates in the US for Russia's 561,000, according to Forbes. And that is this infographic that I have referenced many times. You can see that is the United States, despite having twice the population of Russia, has almost the same number of STEM graduates. And of course, this is China at 4.7 million graduates versus the United States. And you can see the US and all of its so-called network of friends and allies, China eclipses all of them. U.S. economic fundamentals altogether have created a skewed society and correspondingly skewed defense industrial base that is struggling to match that of nations smaller in terms of population and GDP. But even if the U.S. did address these fundamental problems, the fact remains that China alone, saying nothing of the BRICS alliance it is part of, has both solid fundamentals and simply possesses a larger population, economy, and industrial base. The premise upon which U.S. foreign policy is based is unrealistic. The fundamentals of U.S. economic power are fatally flawed. The very notion of the U.S. maintaining a competitive edge over the rest of the world is only realistic if the rest of the world is suffering from significant internal and/or regional instability. This is precisely why the US has invested so heavily over the decades in political interference, political capture, and even regional conflict around the globe. However, The disparity between the US and the rest of the world in terms of economic power, industrial strength, and military might is diminishing faster than the US can impose its international order upon it. A re-emerging Russia alone has exceeded the US in terms of military industrial production. China is surpassing the United States across a much wider multitude of metrics. As long as the US pursues unsustainable policies based on an unrealistic premise, it will not only find itself surpassed by a growing number of nations, it'll find itself isolated and unstable. The difference between nations the US calls adversaries and the US itself is the difference between a farmer who cultivates his land in a sustainable, purposeful way and a predator who mindlessly consumes all in its path until there is nothing left to consume, thus jeopardizing its own self-preservation. At a time between now and then, more rational circles of interest may displace those currently driving US economic and foreign policies and transform the US into a nation pursuing power proportional to its means and invested in working together with other nations of the world rather than attempting to impose itself upon them, which is a sentiment that I usually close most of my articles and also videos with. But I want to go over this article. I just mentioned this earlier this week. This article from The Guardian. This one here. A lot higher than we expected. Russian arms production worries Europe's war planners. Moscow has massively ramped up its industry, giving it advantages in Ukraine and leading to a redistribution of wealth. And what is interesting about this article is that they explicitly explain the difference between Russia's economic and military industrial base and that of the West. This is what the article says. It says, as Ukraine has scrambled to source ammunition, arms, and equipment for its defense, Russia has presided over a massive ramping up of industrial production over the last 2 years that has outstripped what many Western defense planners expected when Vladimir Putin launched his invasion. And then it says the total defense spending has risen to an estimated 7.5% of Russia's GDP. Supply chains have been redesigned to secure many key inputs and evade sanctions. And factories producing ammunition, vehicles, and equipment are running around the clock, often on mandatory 12-hour shifts with double overtime in order to sustain the Russian war machine for the foreseeable future. And then the article has a whole section titled Kalishnikov economy. And this is what it says. Much of this was baked. So how did they achieve? This is what they're explaining. How did Russia achieve this? How are they able to do this while the West is incapable of doing this? So this is how they explain it. And it couldn't be clearer. Much of this was baked into Russia's military industrial complex, a sprawling behemoth of nearly 6,000 companies, many of which rarely turned a profit before the war. But what it lacked in efficiency, it made up for in spare capacity and flexibility when the Russian government suddenly ramped up defense production in 2022. Richard Connolly, an expert on Russia's military and economy at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI think tank in London, called it a Kalishnikov economy, which he said was quite unsophisticated but durable, built for large-scale use and for use in conflicts. But isn't that what a defense industry is supposed to be for? It's supposed to be for use in conflicts, not for maximizing profits at the expense of being unprepared for conflict. The article continues. He said, the Russians have been paying for this for years. They've been subsidizing the defense industry, and many would have said wasting money for the event that one day they would need to be able to scale it up. So it was economically inefficient until 2022, and then suddenly it looks like a very shrewd bit of planning. But this is what Russia, and before Russia, the Soviet Union had did throughout their history. This is what China is also doing. Actually, many countries do this, maybe not necessarily for their defense industry, but for other industries. Their industries are purpose-driven. Their industries are supposed to serve a purpose other than maximizing profit. I did a whole video about Thailand, where I'm based, and the government pharmaceutical organization, and how it does most certainly make money, but doesn't maximize profits. It's trying to make healthcare, medicine, and technology accessible for everybody to improve the health of everybody in the country, whereas in the West, the pharmaceutical industry is maximizing profits, and in the process, it's actually making people less healthy. The exact same process is taking place in the West in regards to their defense industrial base. This is what the article says, the Guardian article, this is what it says about the West in contrast to Russia. That differs significantly from Western, especially European arms manufacturers who generally run lean operations to work across borders and are designed to maximize profit for shareholders. This is what I've been saying for years. This is what I've been talking about since this conflict began. The difference between the profit-driven West and the purpose-driven rest of the world. The US pursues profits at the cost of absolutely everything else. And when we're talking about the defense industrial base, that means at the profits at the cost of having surge capacity, profits at the cost of having an adequate workforce, profits at the expense of maintaining sufficient stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, and profit at the cost of being able to produce enough arms and ammunition to win the wars that you are provoking all around the world, to pursue even more profit and power. I hope that provides at least a little bit of an insight into the US defense industrial base, or I call it the military industrial base, but just to avoid confusion, because that is what they use in the report. If you decide to read the report, the link to it is in the video description. I highly recommend that at least other analysts out there read this report. I'm certain that this topic is going to come up again and again and again as the US continues sponsoring Ukraine in this proxy war against Russia, and as the US continues attempting to provoke a conflict with China. Military industrial capacity is going to be the determining factor. And you can see the fatal flaw at the heart of the collective West's economy, and we can see that Russia and China understand this, and they have avoided this fatal flaw. They have built their society around pursuing a purpose rather than a blind pursuit of profit. And that is going to be the determining factor between the US-led unipolar world and the emerging multipolar world. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check out the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I post absolutely everything on my Telegram channel, including backups of all of my videos. The link to that channel will be in the video description below. There are also links to everything that I cited in this video, including the article that I wrote for New Eastern Outlook right here. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. To those who are supporting my work, whether it's through one-time donations or donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.